Hello and welcome to the party. This is the Peace Party and my name's Carrie. And you have joined us on Messenger Wednesday, where it's all about law enforcement and criminal justice reform. We're going to discuss today, just in a little bit more loose way, once again, areas to reform. And we're going to start off with the topic of mass incarceration, simply because the United States really has one of the highest incarceration rates truly in the free world and unfortunately across the globe. And this truly is something that has not affected the white community here in the United States as much as it affects other communities, which is one of our greatest issues and greatest sins. One of the things that we need to do to reduce the number of people who end up being arrested and incarcerated is to focus on opportunities, especially for students. We need to end the cutback in extracurricular activities and promote things like music and art. When I was in school in the 70s, I was in over 20 different organizations through my 4 years. Now, I'm not suggesting that anybody do that. You know, you could pick 2 to 3, 4 organizations, clubs that you like. You know, move from one freshman year, you don't like that so much anymore, move on to the next, which is sort of what I did. I tried out for football the spring of my freshman year and found out that I was way too skinny and did not want to kill anybody. So football wasn't for me. I tried it though, so it ended up being one of those 20 plus things that I tried. So that's really important, that we have opportunities for students that would most definitely help keep students, preteens and teenagers out of trouble. And then one of the things we need to do is reform and rehabilitate versus this idea of always retaliating. The criminal justice system today is more about retaliating than it is reforming and preventing something from happening in the future in a positive way. We just feel like if you lock them up, that'll solve the problem. That's not necessarily always how it's going to work and has not necessarily succeeded for us. And a lot of these people are nonviolent offenders who need help more than they need an endless life of despair, because that's exactly what's leading to so many of these people ending up back in jail, is that they're nonviolent offenders, but they're also not given any hope, no direction, no way to go forward. And another thing that needs to happen, which has caused a great deal caused the mass incarceration crisis here in the United States, is the idea of mandatory sentencing, especially for nonviolent crimes, and it needs to end, especially when you're talking about drugs. These people, especially somebody who has been busted for having drugs or being an addict, they need help. They need rehabilitation. They need medical care. And just throwing them in jail is not going to really work the problem through, because a lot of it is psychological. Another reform issue is racial disparity and racial disparity in justice. And this is definitely, as we talked about before, a leftover from the era of slavery. There's still very much a racial bias in law enforcement and criminal justice. It occurs within just the number of arrests made. It occurs in the trial courts. It occurs with the convictions and the conviction rate, and then it also has to do with sentencing, and then the mass incarceration. And financial disparities also lead to further higher conviction rates for the poor. And this is where we talked about it in the past. It was either last week if I'm not mistaken, or the week before, but I know we talked about it. Public defenders need to be funded at the same rate as the prosecution. So if the prosecution is given a budget of $100,000, the public defender's office should not be working with a budget of $10,000. They should be working with a budget of $100,000 also. It doesn't make any sense to treat the public defender's office as a sideshow. It's part of our system, and it should be treated as an equal part of our system. Now, dealing with the racial disparities, of course, is not going to be easy. It's not an easy issue to address because there is systematic racism in our community policing. There is racism within our system. We need to change the culture in the prosecutor's office, and that would be one place to start, because it should not be about winning. It should not be about the conviction rate. There should not be a tally board of winners and losers. It should be all about convicting the guilty and acquitting the innocent. No prosecutor should be keeping score. And there should not be animosity between the public defender's office and the prosecutor's office. You both are public servants. And there's no reason for anyone to be looking at a public defender as someone who is a criminal, someone who is anti-society. It's their job, and they chose to be a lawyer. They chose to work and represent people and represent the system and be part of the system. So they are being a positive part of the system, and yet so often prosecutors in the prosecuting office have this idea that they should be able to treat people who are in the public defender's office as less than an equal lawyer. That must end. We also looked at, when we talk about areas to reform, prison conditions and reform. And we're going to get into this a lot more because there's whole sections that we have written about this. But one of the things that we need to get down to is really the idea of occupancy requirements. Overcrowding is illegal. I mean, one of the things in the Constitution, it talks about no cruel and unusual punishment. Well, if you have a cell that was meant for one person, and now you have 4 people living in that cell, sharing that cell, that is cruel and unusual punishment. The cell was meant to be designed for one person, now you have 4. It's not the way things should be done. And that goes to one of the issues. There should be no private prisons whatsoever in the United States of America. Criminal justice and law enforcement reform should not have anything to do with a profit motive. This is not a for-profit enterprise. The last thing we want to see in this country is that we turn criminal justice, the whole system, into a for-profit culture. That's just wrong. So, the other thing that we need to do within the prisons, which does happen but not as much as it should, is access to an education, which also leads to rehabilitation for the life, the convict, the felon who's been convicted, sentenced to life in prison. They can certainly still reform themselves through education. And for those who are going to be released, education is one of the tools to getting a better job and having access to freedom and maintaining your freedom once you do get released. So when we think about reform, that is one of the things that we have to look at. Number one is eliminating private prisons because it should be people before corporate profit, and that's clearly an issue. Sentencing and judicial reform, one of the things that we propose is a 5-person commission which would be formed at the state level to review all sentencing guidelines and correct the many unjust prison terms that have been inflicted upon the masses. When I worked 40 years ago, I was sitting on the DeKalb Housing Advisory Board rewriting all of their housing laws. There were 5 people on this commission. So right from the start, I would say that you would need one person most certainly representing the community on this commission. And it would be in part to figure out how we can eliminate mandatory minimum sentences for all nonviolent crimes, and what does that mean. But it would be really important to go through any state's books and eliminate all of the old archaic laws. I mean, anything from the 19th century clearly needs to be reviewed and looked at for its context, its content, and the historical purpose behind passing that legislation in the first place. What was it about? What was it trying to address? And if it's antiquated, strike it. And that would be what the commission would be about. Making a list of everything that the state legislature needs to look at and strike it and rewrite the laws, rewrite the books. That would help a lot with police accountability, for example. Because one of the things that could be reformed and looked at with all of our archaic laws is the idea of qualified immunity for a police officer. I mean, in theory, a police officer could ring your doorbell, and if you answered the door, as most of us would, the police could enter your home, violate you, and then commit a violent act against your wife, your sister, your aunt, your grandmother, and you wouldn't be able to do anything about it. And they'd be able to get away with it with the idea that they have qualified immunity because, well, they can do whatever they want, right? Now, people are going to argue, no, it's not true. Well, a criminal officer can get away with anything under qualified immunity. It just requires then incredible attorneys who are going to be aggressive to fight back, and they're not plentiful. There are more attorneys who are side with the police officer who committed a criminal act than the victim. And so that is something that has to be changed, that no police officer can just get away with any crime whatsoever without having any fear of being arrested and convicted. Now, the other idea with reform is when someone is released from prison, that they get their voting rights back. It would seem to me that after you've served your time and met all probationary requirements, should be given the right to register to vote and vote in any future election that you so choose. But also something that needs to change is when somebody re-enters society, it's really hard to get a job and it's really hard to find a place to live. And the first thing that we could easily do is no landlord should ever be able to turn down a renter and his or her application simply because they were arrested. We're not talking about a conviction and serving time or anything. We're just talking about being arrested. I worked in real estate, and I know darn well how many clients I had get denied an apartment simply because they had been arrested. Should not be at all allowed. Also, no employer should be able to deny somebody employment simply because they have been arrested. Again, if you haven't been convicted, the arrest doesn't mean anything. You could be arrested for anything at any time, because, as we said, police officers can do whatever they want. Police officers can violate the law, arrest you for something that completely and totally they know you did not do, but they want to harass you anyway because they don't like maybe the t-shirt you're wearing. And they're going to do it. They're going to harass you. Now you have this arrest record, but it doesn't mean that you were convicted. Should never, ever, 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 ever be denied employment or an apartment simply because you were arrested. And when you think about it, these reforms are not outrageous. We're not asking for the moon, and we're not suggesting that people who have committed a crime should not be punished. We are saying, however, that when you have committed a crime that is not violent, we sometimes overreact, and our minimum mandatory sentences do not sometimes reflect the nature of the crime and the possibility of rehabilitation. And